Welcome back to our series on Microsoft Entra with Adnan Hendricks and myself, Kazim. Hi Adnan, how are you doing today?
Hey Kazim, doing great. Good to be back talking about security.
Today's episode is going to be a brief one. In the last episode, we've seen roles and admins and how they work. In this episode, Adnan and I will be talking to you about Microsoft Entra's protected actions. So let's jump straight into it.
Let's go.
Adnan, what are protected actions in Microsoft Entra and how does it relate to conditional access?
Well, like we spoke about in our last episode, right? We spoke about roles and admins and the type of administrative roles you can have. And those roles come with certain rights to it, right? Now, protective actions are specific role permissions. So think in terms of what a specific global admin might be able to do. Now, there are certain role permissions that you want to have happen securely. And whenever somebody tries to perform those actions, we can protect those actions using conditional access. So that's the bottom line when it comes to protective actions and how they are situated within different roles and role permissions.
All right. Thank you, Adnan. How does it work and can you show us how to set it up?
Sure. For that, I'm going to need to share my screen. So I'm signing into my Entra ID. I'm under roles and admins, and within your roles and administrators, with all your roles, the next item would be protective actions. So just by selecting protective actions, these are the special role permissions that I want to protect using conditional access. So if I go to add protective actions, you'll see all the other actions. Now, these are a number of actions that affect your security of your tenant, right? So I've already set up a few with for conditional access policies and also for my cross-tenant access policies, right? So by clicking Add Protective Actions, you'll notice that some of the first things that I need to do is specify an authentication context. Now, to set that up, I need to go to conditional access. Now, conditional access is where we have most of our security, right? That secures our environment. So, for example, when somebody tries to sign in, ensure that they're using MFA or connecting securely, right? So it's a way of applying that zero trust to our identities. But now the nice thing by creating authentication context is I can apply conditional access policy to that authentication context that refers to those protective actions. So not an identity, but specific actions that an identity could perform, right? So see it as an extra level of protection above the normal conditional access policies that we're already providing. So the first thing I need to do is set up a authentication context, and this is just a label or definition that you create. So I've already created a few. For example, my conditional access policy secure is my authentication context to secure any changes to conditional access policy actions. So if somebody tries to create a new conditional access policy, then an extra level of conditional access will be applied. So firstly, you have to create that condition authentication context. I'm just going to click on one so you can see what it's defined. You give it a name. In this case, I'm calling it trusted location. Remember, using your trusted locations in a conditional access policy is one of the ways we can protect specific identities and specific sign-ins, data, etc. within our organization to only allow people to be able to sign in within that location. Now, I always want to ensure that if anybody tries to change or add a trusted location, that extra security controls is being performed. So this is why I'm calling it trusted location. I'm giving in the description. You see that it has an ID. And then once I've got my authentication context, I go back to protected actions because that's the action that I want to protect. So I'm going to select my authentication context. And then by selecting permissions, you'll see that one of the secure actions that I want to protect using this context, the authentication context, would be the named locations actions. So whenever somebody tries to create one, delete one, or make changes to existing, because you don't want to have some hacker coming in and making changes to your trusted locations, right? So quite often in some locations, I know certain companies don't require MFA if somebody's signing into using a trusted location. So you always want to make sure that these things are extra secured. So these are the actions I want to protect. And then I can just save it. So Kazim, now that I've created my authentication context and I've associated those to the protected actions that I'm trying to protect, now I'm going to secure them using conditional access. So I need to go to conditional access and create a new conditional access policy that's going to add that extra level of protection so that whenever somebody's trying to perform those actions, these requirements need to be met. So by creating a new policy within my conditional access, and I'm going to call it updating trusted locations. So in this case, it's not applied to any user or group. I'm just going to be targeting that authentication context. This is where I will select the authentication context and specify whatever conditions I require. And this can be where I might say I want to configure only specific Windows devices. Here, I could also add that they can only do it from a trusted location, for example. And I can also use extra requirements like filtering on specific devices. If a company is using secure access workstations or privileged access workstations, this is where they can configure those and only filter based on those devices to add that extra layer of protection. And once again, I can say grant access if MFA has been required and also if the devices may be compliant. So any changes made to these authentication contexts will be applied. And that's really all I need. Whenever somebody tries to go and make changes to these kind of protective actions, that extra level of conditional access will be applied. So obviously, once I've created it, it takes a few minutes for the changes to be in effect. But that's all you require. So by protecting those actions, using that authentication context and applying it through conditional access policies. So even if somebody is in that role and they're able to make those changes, this extra step will be applied.
There's something I need us to just reiterate, just for the benefit of people who might not understand what authentication context mean. I know you've mentioned it a few times, and you've also explained it during the setup, right? But let me ask you just one more time, Adnan. What does it mean? What is authentication context?
Authentication context is really just a description that you create that applies to specific protective actions. So your protective actions are the role assignments. And because you can have a number of different actions, you can refer to them using this authentication context. A nice place where you can use this authentication context, think of it as the security labels in information protection or purview. And this is a way we can use labels on actions, like actions that need to be done securely. Think of example for administrative staff that might want to add themselves into a specific role that will give them extra rights. So that's also one of the things you can go and protect using an authentication context. Can I show you my example?
Okay, yes, please go ahead, Adnan.
So referring back to my demo environment, I'm going back to the roles and admins. And one of the roles, I'm just going to select application administrator. So I'm at the role settings. So I already have privileged identity management where assigned to a group. So everybody in that group can automatically give themselves or assign themselves the application administrator role. But now I can add that extra level of protection whenever they do that. So I can enable that by editing my role settings and go to the activation. Now, activation says for how long do I want them to be able to be administrators or be in this role. So I can specify a time. And on activation, whereas we could add an extra Azure MFA, now I have the extra option to provide the authentication context. So the authentication context adds that extra level of conditional access requirements. And this is where I can select whenever somebody's trying to add themselves into this role, the strong authorization authentication context needs to be challenged, right? And my strong authentication could be a requirement that they only get this role utilizing trusted location, secure access workstation, and maybe even doing MFA again or performing that requirement. So that's one of the ways in which we can add that extra level by referring to the authentication context. And then I can just update that. And I can do it with all my PIM roles. So whoever is normal administrator can assign themselves that role, and that action will only be performed if that specific conditional access is met for that authentication context. So I hope that's one of the ways all our viewers would be able to see where you can add this extra level of protection for certain actions that specific roles might have.
Thank you very much, Adnan. But just before we wrap up, Adnan, I want you to tell us where else can we use authentication context?
Roles and administrators. So within PIM, and as you can see, that's also in preview. So within a lot of extra permissions, locations where we might need that extra level of protection, that is where this will be a requirement in future. And we can apply it to data, applications, and to specify those authentication contexts at those locations where that extra conditional access policy requirement will be needed.
All right, here's where we'll wrap up today's episode. Thank you, Adnan, for the walkthrough. Any last words from you before we say goodbye?
You can never have too much security, Kazim. So I hope all our viewers will be looking at implementing this feature for all their actions that they need to secure or access securely.
Thank you for tuning in. And from Adnan and I, it's a bye-bye, and we'll see you again in the next episode. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.